Hello and welcome to our 2025 Winter Lead Academy series. I'm Ashley VenHorst, Seed and Seed Treatment Manager here with Liqui-Grow.
And I'm Phil Long, Regional Agronomist with Liqui-Grow. And today, Ashley and I are going to be going through a fun topic on seed guides. We've got them all out in front of us here, so we're going to go through every one of them, step by step, each product.
Can't wait.
So, no, we're not. But what we're going to do is we're going to give a really good overview for growers to help pick a few things apart, talk about a few different things, nuances, I guess we could say, between all of these, and some key areas to focus your attention. I'm going to kind of go through a top three kind of for each corn and beans and what to look for, and hopefully it'll give growers a better understanding of some really critical pieces of information that they should look for in each. Like I said, it's not going to be a comprehensive overview, 4 hours long. But we are going to hopefully give some good insight into what these seed guides mean and how they can be valuable to your operation.
Yes. So we pulled out every seed guide that I have, and just right off the bat, every brand grades their diseases differently. So one is 1 to 9, 1 being the best, 9 being the worst, and then you go to the next one and it's totally opposite. 9 is the best, 1 is the worst. So if they could all do the same thing, that'd make it a lot easier for you to comprehend what they're saying.
It's a very frustrating part of seed guides,
yes.
in my opinion. Yeah, we didn't have to go very far to figure it out. I feel like this is something, I compare this to tractors and equipment back 40, 50 years ago when everybody had their own hydraulic couplers. So different equipment, you couldn't hook it up to a red tractor, couldn't hook up to a green piece of equipment. I mean, very frustrating.
Yes.
They finally all got on the same page with ISO couplers. That's kind of the same thing here, except not everybody's on the same page.
Yes.
So it's very frustrating that 1 may be excellent and then the next book 9 is excellent, and that's exactly what we're looking at right here. But I mean, everybody is allowed to have their own discrepancy on these, and sometimes it seems a little backwards. But the key is going and understanding what the scale is between them to figure out quickly where you're sitting at, what's good and what's not good. And a lot of times, they're never going to put a terrible score in there. So,
right.
If 9's the worst, likely you're not going to see a 9. That's just the way it is. And honestly, we hope that they're not putting 9s in their product guide. I mean, we're hoping that they're, selecting products. I know from past experiences, if it doesn't meet a certain category, you're not going to move that product forward, So it's not, you're not going to see a 9 in something. So a lot of times I hear that from farmers like, well, they never put a 9 in there. Well, yep.
They're not going to sell a 9
Yeah,
product.
they don't want to sell a 9. Even if it's just in one disease category, you don't want to see a 9 in there because that is a huge downfall for that and likely won't make it past a few years once growers figure out,
terrible
it buckles
product
at the knees or it's terrible on gray leaf spot or whatever. So you're not going to see many 9s. But the other side of that is the average. I feel a lot of times that average, if you're looking at a middle ground score and a slightly above, it's better than what you think. So
they're going to be a little conservative is what you're saying.
Yes.
They're not going to give you a 1 or a perfect score, but they're also not going to give you the worst score. They're going to be a little conservative on the better numbers, but also they're not going to launch a terrible product.
Yeah, and they, growers may think the opposite, but seed companies want to be conservative because, and a lot of times they update that score too, but they want to be conservative because if they're a little harsh on themselves, then they can always make it better.
Right.
But you don't want to make it worse. You don't want it to go, from a 2 of excellent or 2 or close to excellent down to a 3 or a 4. You'd rather bring that up if it's getting better with white mold or whatever the case is. But a lot of times, that's the case. And like I said, with new products, that's especially the case.
Be a little more conservative.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. And they're using less data too. So it's a little more speculation. You have a lot less when we're looking at data, it's like looking at 1 year compared to 6 years of data. You're a little less confident, and so sometimes they just say, NA or something like that. And that just means that they don't have enough information to make a call if it can tolerate white mold or whatever the score you're looking at is.
Sure. So when I open my seed guide, there's a lot going on here, as well as yours, as well as the others. Where do I go first? What is, if we're talking corn, what is the most important thing that I'm looking at in my seed guide, Phil?
Yeah, so this obviously can be different depending on the person, but from what I feel like, and you're gonna notice a theme here on the corn side. In my opinion, I think all these, it's gonna start out my top number one is going to be emergence and early vigor. So it's funny, you don't even have to think about it, but in terms of corn, you think more offensively. So I'm not a big sports guy, but I understand offense and defense. I have played sports in the past. But when it comes to corn, I think more offensively. And so that's why the first thing I think of is emergence and early vigor.
Sure.
Which I imagine you do as well.
Yes.
When you're bringing seed out to the farm. That's a
Yeah.
critical piece of information that guys keep in the forefront of their mind.
Absolutely. That is one of the biggest things that I'd say we look at when I'm going to seed meetings is what is that emergence and then what is that early season vigor going to look like? Because if you're an early planter as a farmer, you want to plant early, you want to make sure you have that early vigor score that is pretty decent in the book.
Yeah, and encouraging them to sort that out in the wintertime so
Right.
that in the spring they don't have that excuse of, well, that was in the back of the shed. The one that had the green light and you really could plant that one early was in the back of the shed. No,
Yeah.
move that to the front.
Yep.
Make sure it's up there because when you're ready to go and start planting this spring, it's on the early side. You want that hybrid, not the one that's potentially going to have issues. I mean, that's my first thing, and a lot, like I said, sometimes you usually see emergence, sometimes you'll see early plant vigor, things like that, and pay attention on the other side of that. There's usually descriptions, and a lot of times they'll say that fast, first out of the ground or fast out of the ground or something like that. That's another indication of that characteristic that it's going to come out of the ground quick, and that's what you want if you're planting it early because corn is all about emergence, getting that stand out of the ground right. Soybeans, I don't care as much about that, but getting it out of the ground uniformly and evenly is very critical for corn and competition between plants. So
Sure.
that's number one in my
Yes.
book.
What's number two?
Number two is I'm going to lump like three together because obviously you got to have more than one since it's only top three. I could have done top 10, I guess.
We
But
could
no.
have. We'll keep it to top three. Spare you all some time.
So number two for me would be the strength of the plant. So root strength, stalk strength, and green snap. This is one personally on my own farm and stuff. I take into high consideration. Root and stalk strength is really important. There's obviously a difference between the two. Root strength, and these play into the disease part too. All this stuff intertwines into each other. So if root strength or stalk strength is poor, it likely has issues late in the season. It may get certain things, crown rots and things into that lower stem. So those should all be thoughts as you're looking at the diseases too, to play into that. But I want a plant that's going to stand out there. If you're going to be harvesting early, maybe you don't care quite as much about that, but in my opinion, it's still critically important because that strength of that stalk all season long, we get a lot of wind, things like that. You want that. We got rootworm, lots to discuss in that area, but stalk strength, root strength, and green snap, my eyes go directly to right away. So if it's got a poor or below average rating on one of those, then that's either one you're going to want to really protect with fungicides, or manage, I should say. Make sure you're managing that one because it's not that it's bad and not to give anything away, but a lot of times, we talk about this too, but we rob really good offensive hybrids, rob nutrients from the lower stalk, especially when they're stressed late season. The highly offensive racehorse hybrids tend to do that more than the other ones. So a lot of times you'll see those high-end racehorse hybrids with maybe not as great of a root or stalk strength rating.
Sure.
It's not that you need to kick that one out. This is all about managing risk. So you still can keep that one in your lineup. Don't plant the farm to it, but manage for it. That's one that, you're going to want to keep an eye on. Should be scouting anyway, but maybe a fungicide, a well-timed fungicide, and whatnot. We have lots of options nowadays. In furrow, there's lots of options that we have for protecting that plant. So,
in the Midwest, we do have a lot of wind events, and we have had them over the last few years. So protecting that stalk strength and that root strength, that's going to be very important going into these seasons where we've seen more and more wind events happening. So
unfortunately, we don't like seeing that. And then the other side of that too, not to get too far off into the weeds, but stalk strength, paying attention to that, and then what your planting population is, because planting population, that inter-row competition is what determines that stalk size. So if you have a poor stalk strength and then you're going to plant it at 38,000, you're going to weaken that even more. Yeah. So, like I said, all this stuff's intertwined.
It all goes together.
Just trying to give everybody, one of those things that I see most, that happens the most, especially going for high yields.
Yeah, absolutely. So we did number 1, which was your emergence and your vigor. Number 2 was your stalk strength and your root strength.
Yep.
What's number 3, Phil?
So we got to get to the not so fun stuff at some point, but diseases, the disease ratings, and that's, like most of these books, that's half of the chart, and that's a lot of times that's what people are like. I don't want to look at all this stuff. Give me the nuts and the bolts. Well, the simplest thing for me, in my opinion, is you should know your history of your field. So, if gray leaf spot or some of these diseases can come in. This year's a great example of that. We had southern rust. That's not a disease that we typically see a lot of.
Right.
So, but we do have all these ratings here, and I'm not saying you have to pay attention to every one of them. Because you may not have had an issue with that. Same on the soybean side, which we'll get to. But knowing your top few diseases should be the ones that your eyes naturally go to, whether that's gray leaf spot or something like that. That should be the focus. But yes, you still have to have strong disease. I call them, they're all agronomic ratings, but those are the agronomics that are really important, is those disease ratings. And once again, this is something we can manage for. We can protect with.
Absolutely.
But it still needs to be something that's, something you're using to
forefront.
select.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you open your seed book after your seed rep leaves, these are some great things to be looking for after they leave. That way you can have an insight as to what they're telling you and understand it hopefully a little bit better on the corn side. Yeah. Should we dive right into beans?
Yeah. And then we can circle back around and finish with a fun topic.
Yes.
So on the soybean side, I'm flipping the script because this is just the way, in my opinion, I think a lot of growers should think of it. Whether you have really high-yielding soybean fields or not, it should be more of a defensive thought process in your mind when you're thinking about selecting soybeans. Like I said, not trying to say that if you can get 70 to 80 or 90 bushel, awesome. But the key to soybeans is protecting it from stress. And that, in my mind, is defense. So starting with the defensive side, first is going to be diseases. So everybody knows these, but in soybeans, it's a bigger problem. They can get hit much harder, whether it's things like white mold. The one I have on here, which I think everybody should pay attention to, is Phytophthora root rot. That's one. Like I said, we're not getting too far into the weeds, but when it comes to Phytophthora, there's Phytophthora genes, and there's some that are more effective for certain areas. And a lot of times you'll see stacked genes in there as well. Maybe it's got a K and a C gene, or whatever the case, or a 3A, or whatever the case is. The other thing is sometimes it doesn't have a gene, but several years ago they started rating just field tolerance. And so a lot of books have field tolerance in them too. The initial theory on that was, don't get a soybean without the trait in it. But the field tolerance, in a lot of cases, they show really good. So that's just natural breeding. Right. Like anything with genetics, you're naturally breeding it for typically yield, but that comes with the pressure that's in those fields. So naturally breeding Phytophthora root rot resistance into it, and Phytophthora is one of those things that you can see all year long. It's not a seedling disease, it's all year long. Yes. I've been out there in July and August, and you see it killing plants. So it's
and
one
at
of
that
those,
point there's just nothing that you can do about it, so your hands are tied.
And the earlier it comes in, the worse
it is.
The worst in terms of yield it is. So it's one of those things you should just check it off the list. Okay, do I have something that can protect me from Phytophthora? Because pretty much every field out there has pressure from that disease. So,
and the next one's coming up are SDS and soybean cyst nematode. So making sure that those scores are pretty good as well to avoid having any of those issues down later in the season. I mean, two huge ones. I mean, SCN I would say is the top in terms of pests that rob the most yield from soybeans. SCN is paramount, whether you have tested for it before or know you have it, what levels you have it at. It's likely there. We move it around. Most people do tillage. Unfortunately, it's in every area, and especially in our territory, but even on up to basically Canada, it's spread far and wide at this point, and it's just one of those things. Like I said, the gene, it's important. We've talked about that before, PI 88788, but also Peking. Now we have more options on that side too, which is great. The biggest thing is rotating, and we should know this from the corn side and corn rootworm and so forth, but rotating those modes of action. And something that I heard that Iowa State
Greg Tilka mentioned several years ago, this always stuck with me and I'm not an expert breeder. I'm not a plant breeder. But not every one of those soybeans that have PI 88788 have the same tolerance built into them.
Right.
So it's a breeding process. And so it may not get all, the full package essentially. Maybe it gets 3/4 of it, and that's all that specific variety could accept.
Right.
So think of it that way too, not just planting the same bean on that acre, 2 years down the road, even if it's PI 88788, rotating
the traits that are in
the genetics. As long as it's not the same exact bean you planted 2 years ago, just because you like that one, rotate it out. Even if it's the same gene, you likely are changing that up enough. That's the key to managing resistance. So peaking obviously too, but yeah, just a lot of things in that category. SCN, SDS, they work hand in hand too. Usually, if there's one, there's the other one there. So it's a battle both ways. But those are probably the top ones, as
for
you
beans.
mentioned.
Yeah. So the first thing you look at in a bean seed guide is diseases. Make sure that you're covered on your diseases that that you have in your field. So what would number 2 be?
So you kind of covered part of number 2, but
good.
it's just a continuation of more diseases. Like I said, defense. But I would throw into this if they have, like the second tier of issues. In my area, it's IDC. So, iron chlorosis. And I've even seen in competitors, they all describe it differently too. Now it's usually IDC. Now I've seen it as FEDC. Iron, the element. So it's like they want to confuse people.
Everybody. That's the goal.
Once you figure it out and how they're rated and stuff, it's not. You just want to make sure that you're looking at the products that rise to the top of that. If you have issues like an IDC or something, whatever that bad issue is for you, should be at the top of your list, especially when it comes to soybeans.
Right. So it's not quite a one size fits all, but if you know that you've had an issue in your area or in your field in the past, maybe that's something that you should be paying a little bit more attention to on the defensive side for beans.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. So, and then my last one, maybe people would say, oh, this wouldn't be my third choice, but this is what I'm going to put in there, and that's basically the structure of the plant. And I think a lot of times this gets overlooked, but what I'm saying, and it's different in all of them, but plant height, the structure of it, so how well does it branch? A lot of these things that growers don't always think about, but if you're planting in 30-inch rows, you should be thinking about it. Even if you're planting in 15s, you should be thinking about it, because that's two different types of plants. If you're planting in 15s or narrow rows, you want a plant that, it's not going to fall over, because some of those plants are made to branch and get big. And the competition, when you put them in narrow rows, makes them grow tall and get lazy.
Yes.
So you got to understand that. You got to look at that plant type. If you're growing in 30s, you should want the opposite, because you want it to fill out that row. You know, a lot of people like seeing the row. No, you don't want to see the row.
You don't want to see the rows.
In terms of soybean yield, if you care about soybean yield at all, take this point home. You want it to cover that row. You want, essentially what the plant wants is 95%, and I'm going to get a little nerdy, but PAR, they call it, photosynthetically active radiation. So essentially it wants to cover the row. And those leaves at the lower canopy can sense that. So when it's not covered, it can sense that. So when there's light coming down, obviously there's going to be weeds that can still germinate too with light hitting the ground. But it can sense that the row's not covered. And so optimal, or the highest yield you can possibly achieve, will be achieved when you can hit that sooner to flowering. So in our geography, that's near impossible.
Yes.
By R1, which can hit early July. Most 30-inch rows are not covered by then. So people are like, why try it? Well, if you're planting on the earlier side, you're getting more nodes, you're getting more plant structure, and it grows quick. So you just want it to canopy as quickly as possible.
And we've also been learning too, the newest rating that's come out is BPI. So whether that yield is on the main stem and not on the branches, or if it's on the branches and not so much on that main stem, and that can affect too your canopy. If it's on the canopy or on the branches, your canopy can be a little bit wider. Versus if it's on the main stem, everything's going to grow a little bit more.
And in 30-inch rows, you want some of that branching, and you want those branches to be productive. I've been in a lot of fields where those branches are not as productive and so forth. Hopefully they are. That's likely an indication of fertility or other things. But you want to see that unless you're in narrow rows. Then that's not that's all in understanding what your doing on your farm and getting that plant to fit that program.
Yeah. So really taking into account what you've seen on your acre in years past and what has been in your area. Because like Phil is up in the Hampton Clear Lake area. IDC is huge up there.
Yeah.
We don't see that as much around here in the local Scott County, Clinton County area, but SCN and IDC, or SCN and SDS is a lot more prominent in this area. So
Yeah, for us, it's IDC, white mold, SDS, SCN. I mean, yeah, I feel like a government official throwing all these acronyms around here, but most people know what they mean, and if you're in that area, then you for sure know what it means. And I would say, unfortunately, those things, they just keep spreading. White mold and so forth too likes to be in pockets, but yeah, every year's different.
Yes.
And if you ignore those and say, well, I haven't had that for several years, that's when it's going to hit you.
That's when it hits.
And things like SDS and compaction, all those things that work against you. If you're trying to plant early and get good yields, it could bite you. You know, that's just part of the management part of that. You want to plant early to get more node production and seed production, but you know, you're going to end up maybe fighting another disease like SDS.
Just know where to be precautious and how to manage it accordingly.
How to manage. Yep. Be ready to manage accordingly. Exactly.
Perfect. Okay, Phil, the next topic that we want to cover is GDUs. So can you give us a little background and definition on what GDUs is and how we calculate GDUs for corn?
Sure. So growing degree units, calculated, basically it's the average temperature of the day, the high and the low, divided by 2, minus our base of 50. So growth stops at 50 degrees, so we can't go below that in terms of nighttime temperatures, and 86 is the top. So this is why when you're sitting there, you know, people say, oh, it's great corn growing weather and it's 105 out. Well, much past about 95, corn growth really slows down. But GDUs is really important because we can pretty much know, like I said, 120 or so, 90 to 120, and the corn's out of the ground. Once we get to that point, then we can just use those GDUs and we can calculate every growth stage because the corn is very predictable that way. So it's a really good indicator of growth, timing, setting things up for the season, understanding when things are going to happen. But like I said, it's a driver. So just remember that too as you're going throughout the season that, you know, once we get above that 86, you know, it doesn't stop. Actually, plant death starts to happen above like 105. But like at 95, the plant's trying to survive.
Right.
You know.
It's hit that stress point. If it's above 86, we've hit a stress point that we're not really going to see a ton of growth.
Yeah, growth kind of slows down at that point. So yeah, in a best case scenario, you know, if we had 85 during the day, 75 at night in the summertime, you calculate that out, you're going to have about 30 GDUs for that day. So they can stack up quickly. You know, when we're sitting there in the springtime waiting for it to come out of the ground and we're getting 0, it's frustrating.
Yeah.
But in the summertime, they can stack up quickly, especially if we don't have, you know, a lot of recovery at night or cool temperatures and things like that.
Sure.
But why is this really important other than why, you know, me explaining it? Why is it important for the grower to understand that?
Yeah. So when you look in your book, any of your seed guides, you'll see GDUs to pollination or silk, or you'll see GDUs to black layer. So when we're deciding on the brand that we want to use or even the hybrid we want to use, we really want to make sure that we're stacking apples to apples. So we're really using 108 with 108 and that it's not 108 on the book, but really the GDUs, it's 110 or 112 day. So the maturity, I'm not going to say that they're lying, but the maturity is really just a relative maturity. It's really based on those GDUs, making sure that we're comparing to pollination or to black layer and that they're both comparing to that same growth point and that we're not comparing to two different growth points.
Yeah, it's like you said, it's a relative maturity.
Yes.
That's exactly what it is. And you know, that black layer, the GDUs, it seemed like many years ago they didn't put a lot of this stuff in the book, and now we have it separated in 2 different sections, which is great. You know, and that GDUs to black layer can really help you make that comparison and know, you know, how when's it going to finish up? You know, is that true on the day length that it truly is? But in my mind, one of the keys that should stick out for a grower is the other part of that, which is the GDUs to silking or flowering or whatever you want to call it. The first part of those GDUs to get it to reproduction, because that's really where you're going to mitigate and spread out that risk, because that's when the worst stuff happens. So our genetics are very good nowadays, and I will say that this is nowhere like it was 30 years ago. 30 years ago even, we had hybrids that, because of the stress in the middle of the season, if it was a droughty situation, those silks are a lot of water, so they're going to be the first thing to slow down in a drought situation. So older hybrids would not get the silks out, and then we'd have terrible pollination. So that pollination window is what you're trying to look at. So if you're looking at a couple hybrids, you write them down, write those GDUs to silk down, and compare those. I pulled out 2 here just for an example, 102 and 112 day, and they were 60 GDUs apart. Well, that sounds like a lot.
Right.
But I just gave you
Really,
the
in the
example
middle of July.
of 30 GDUs per day. So that's 2 days.
2 days.
So
for
we have
110 day relative maturity difference, you're only 2 days to your pollination difference.
Yeah, so whether that's, some of them will say it a little different. They'll say, flowers early for maturity or flowers late for maturity or on par, basically.
Yeah.
That's the same way, but GDU is a little more accurate. So you can line those up, look at them, and say, okay, how far apart are we? And like I said, just keep in mind that in July, when they're going into pollination, it's really hot out.
Right.
So you may be getting 20 to 30 day or GDUs per day, and that should make you decide in your mind. Obviously, planting date and a lot of other physical, environmental characteristics affect that, but that is one way to help spread out that risk in terms of yield loss and making sure that those don't line up right on top of each other, hopefully.
Yeah. And then as we said, like the 10 relative maturity day difference, it might only be 2 days difference at silk, but going into black layer, you're going to see maybe a week or a 7 to 10 day difference when they're ready for harvest. So they're probably going to line up pretty close at the silk time frame, but going into harvest, you're going to see a lot bigger of a difference.
Yeah, not to get off topic here, but you're exactly right. And maybe it's an early flowering for maturity, and what these modern hybrids are doing is they're opening up that reproductive window. So what does that do? We spend more time filling seeds. So that's a good thing. And yeah, like I said, you can get far down this road, but you may see those GDUs to black layer line up closer than you think at the end, but that window in the reproduction period is longer, which is a good thing. But like I said, when it comes to mitigating the risk around pollination and when we typically see droughty issues, keeping that GDUs to silking or pollination or R1, whatever it says in the book, in mind is crucial.
Yeah. All right, well, thanks, Phil, for joining us today and digesting the seed guide with us. Hopefully that didn't confuse you more, but when we drop off the seed books, you can at least understand it a little bit better and kind of know what we're talking about when we make these recommendations.
And thanks, Ashley, for letting me join in on this discussion. Hopefully growers took away a nugget or two that they can glean from this. As always, if they have any questions, we have a whole team to help them with those questions. So thanks for joining us on this Lead Academy video.
Lead Academy.
Liqui-Grow
Excellence
and agronomy
Development.